For battle prepared in their country's just cause, their king to avenge and support all his laws. As fierce as a tiger, as swift as the roe, the British Light Infantry rush on their foe. Cross the deep gullied vale, up the mountain's steep side, through the rough foaming river's impetuous tide, o'er the fortified redoubt close wedged in array, regardless of safety, they follow their prey. Those were two verses from a song titled simply The British Light Infantry, published 1778 in the Royal Gazette in New York by a Loyalist refugee. But who were the British Light Infantry of the American War of Independence, and what set them apart from the rest of the army? How were they selected? How did they train? And most importantly, how did they fight? We'll answer all of that and more in this video, which is brought to you by the Native Oak, made possible by the generosity of its membership, and has been sponsored by Blinkist, but more about them later. Light infantrymen became an official part of the Army establishment in 1771, and by the time of the American War of Independence, they represented a portion of pretty much every regular Army infantry regiment. We'll talk more about regimental organization in future, but suffice to say for now that every regiment is made up of a number of companies, generally numbering on paper between around 40 to 70 privates each. It's going to depend on the year and the setting and whatnot, plus officers, NCOs, drummers, and the like, though naturally the real strength could vary a great deal from the on-paper strength. The bulk of these companies were so-called battalion companies. They were your standard infantrymen, the mainstay of the army with their cocked hats and plain regimental coats. And then every regiment would have two elite flank companies, so called because when the regiment was on parade, they would generally be on either the left or right flank of the battalion men, which would march in the center of the formation. And sometimes that would also apply in battle, with certain companies always standing on a certain flank in battle, but that wasn't really the case during the American War of Independence. There just weren't a lot of opportunities for that kind of thing to take place. Now, one of these flank companies was the Grenadier Company, and they always took the place of honor at the regiment's right, again during parades, not necessarily battles. You can learn more about them in two of my previous videos, Who Were the British Grenadiers, and The British Grenadiers Didn't Actually Use Grenades. So they were on the right, while the other flank company, who was parading to the regiment's left, were the Light Infantry Company. And that's a pretty helpful way, I think, to think about these guys as well. The Light Infantry are kind of like a counterbalance to the Grenadiers, at least on paper. While the Grenadiers were often chosen for their strength, their size, their courage, an ideal light infantryman would be chosen for his speed and agility, his marksmanship and intelligence. Because while Grenadiers were heavy troops, the shock infantry, if you will, the light infantry were, well, exactly what you'd expect. They were usually fighting in open order, which is to say they're fighting with more space between the individual men in their formations. They're going to be running around on the battlefield, moving from cover to cover, and taking carefully aimed shots, rather than firing in mass volleys. These are skirmishers, they're marksmen, and because of that, they were among the most efficient and feared soldiers in the British Army during the American War of Independence. So much so, in fact, that most of the regular army actually began to adopt light infantry tactics pretty much from the war's onset. But that's another topic for another day. The light infantry equipment and uniforms had an emphasis on maneuverability and practicality, but naturally they would vary pretty dramatically from year to year, from campaign to campaign, and especially regiment to regiment. Because you see, nothing can ever be simple in the 18th century. At the very beginning of the war, this was the basic appearance for a Redcoat light infantryman. They wore a red regimental coat with different color facings depending on the regiment they were a part of, just like any other soldier in the army. But unlike the other companies, these coats were generally cut down to a much shorter length. And as one of the two flank companies, they also had wings, a simple lacing pattern, on their shoulders. The Grenadiers had the same thing. It didn't serve a practical function, it was purely ceremonial, indicative of their elite status. And rather than wearing the white or buff-colored waistcoats of the rest of the army, light infantrymen wore red waistcoats that blended pretty nicely with their regimentals, and those waistcoats would be cut straight across the bottom in a shorter style than usual. Their belting was a little different too. While the majority of the army would wear buff leather belting, which they would then whiten with pipe clay, the light infantry would usually use tanned leather, which was then blackened. And while generally speaking they would wear the same belts and accoutrements as the rest of the army, on occasion, and mainly very early on, you could see some light infantrymen with something called belly boxes rather than cartridge pouches. The idea was probably that the rounds would be easier to access from a belly box in front of them, but in practice such boxes carried less rounds than a pouch at the man's side and would constrict his breathing while honestly not actually being easier to reach, at least in my experience. Especially if the man is firing kneeling or especially prone, as the light infantrymen were, apt to do, it's actually going to be a lot harder to reach the belly box than one on the hip. Similarly, earlier on in the war, they would also sometimes carry hatchets at their belts right alongside their bayonets, meaning that their belting would have an extra frog to accommodate that. Now, the easiest way for a layman to spot this kind of earlier war light infantryman would be his headgear. Rather than the wide-brimmed cocked hat of the battalion companies, the lights would wear small, usually leather, helmets. Those helmets might be adorned with plumage or left plain, and they would come in a variety of different shapes and color schemes, all depending on the regiment that the company belongs to. They probably wouldn't provide all too much in the way of protection against a falling saber, but you can see how they'd be a little more apt for running around through the woods than a cocked hat or bearskin cap would be. Now, as for their weaponry, there isn't really much to write home about. Again, while there are near always distinctions to be made, light infantrymen would generally be carrying the same weapons as any other regular soldier, mainly being the short land pattern musket with a bayonet. I'll link a video down below for you if you'd like to learn about some of the more specialized weapons that you could sometimes see, but for the most part, know that they're being armed in pretty much the same way as the rest of the army. However, it must be said that this was by no means the only appearance of the British light infantry. Rather, this was how many of them looked when the war started, but as things progressed, as more regiments are being shipped over, as the war is spreading to different theaters with their own distinctive conditions, things are going to change, and pretty dramatically. Enter the coolest aesthetic of the war, the bloodhound. You can see how differently these light infantrymen of the 40th Regiment of Foot look, for example. They're still a light infantry company, but rather than wearing cut-down regimental coats, they're wearing much simpler, sleeved waistcoats. And that's exactly what it sounds like. The same red waistcoat as we saw earlier, but with sleeves and facings thrown onto it. In this case, they also have wings, but of a much simpler appearance. And because it's less layers, they're cooler, they're less bulky than a full set of regimentals. They're also easier to produce and easier to move around in. They're well suited to fighting deep in the woods and extreme heat of North America. And the 40th Regiment weren't the only ones to do this either. Multiple regiments of light infantrymen would adopt this highly practical style. Another adaptation made was with their headgear. Leaving aside those more specialized and difficult to produce light infantry helmets, many regiments adopted the wearing of this rather sportsmanlike hat. They're made of the same materials as any other cocked hat, and as such they're highly commonplace, but of a simpler construction, a lot of times with only one side turned up to prevent the man from knocking his hat off when he's shouldering his musket. And these wide-brimmed hats are also going to provide more protection from the sun than a helmet would, which could be of pretty strong importance when you're taking a carefully aimed shot. Other times, while using the same common materials, just regular old cocked hats, they would fashion new styles that were reminiscent of the original light infantry helmets, but without the need of any leather working. For example, these men of the 15th Regiment of Foot. Other adaptations would often include the wearing of gaitered trousers, and this is actually something that all kinds of soldiers, not just light infantrymen, would come to wear as well because of how much better they were. The more traditional look that you'd expect to see at the war's outbreak was for men to have knee-length breeches and stockings, with then a third piece of clothing, the gaiters, being wrapped tightly around the ankles, sometimes the whole lower leg, and buttoned up the side to protect one's feet on the march. Gaitered trousers, though, or as they were usually known, trousers, simplified the whole process while being easier to put on, wear, and looking a lot cooler. This was a single piece of clothing, much like trousers today, except they were very tight around the ankles with buttons down their side, and much like gaiters, they had a leather strap which would go under the heel to keep them tight. These trousers would serve the same role in that way as gaiters, while being equally durable and more convenient. The light infantry were a utilitarian force. Their uniforms were short-cut and tight to the body, allowing them to move more quickly and efficiently through rough terrain. Throughout the American War of Independence, they would make a variety of alterations to their kit, making them more comfortable and streamlined, while also adapting them to the harsher realities of North American campaigning. Say, you're an enthusiastic young officer newly assigned to the Light Infantry. Goody, I sure am. What a fantastic moment for your career. Oh, you've long envied those shortcut lights dashing about on the field, turning out the filthy rebels. And now I'll be one of them. Right in the thick of the action I'll be. I can taste the glory and promotions already. Well, that is, until it all comes crashing down on you. What does? Why, that horrifying realization that you really don't know anything at all about light infantry fighting. Well, I can study it. Well, of course you can if you have a few extra years on your hands. I mean, literature is great, but dear Lord, there's just so much of it. Symes, Cuthbertson, Townshend, Hindle. You hardly have time to read anything at all given your regular duties. You're gonna read all that? Oh dear. Well, thank heavens that grizzled old sergeant from your old company is able to give you some advice before you move out. Wait, who? Why, you good little gentleman, there's no warrant for worry. I don't feel like this voice is very appropriate for whoever you're supposed to be. Just click the link in the description and start a 7-day free trial of Blinkist with 25% off your premium membership. But what is Blinkist? And what's a link in the description? Why, Blinkist helps you to understand and discover complicated and powerful ideas from some of the best books and podcasts on the market today, all in just 15 minutes. Only 15 minutes to get all the big ideas and important elements from entire books and What's a podcast? That's right, my lad. They have over 5,000 titles in 27 different categories to choose from. Everything from history and philosophy and politics. Oh, those are very important. To money and investments, which I know you could use some advice on given your horrible gambling debts. That is true. A lot of junior officers were horribly indebted during the 18th century. For example, they even have Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World by Neil Ferguson. I'm sure it was nothing but wonderful and good and wholesome things. Yes, right. Anyways, you can learn all about the wars that helped to grow and ultimately destroy the Empire, all in just 16 minutes. Wait, what do you mean, destroyed? For example, did you know that one of the biggest inspirations for our glorious Empire was basically just how much we love tea, coffee, sugar, ginger, and chocolate? Why, our tea consumption went from only £800,000 to over 2.5 million just between 1740 and 1750. And thank goodness we had so much Spanish gold to loot, else we'd never be able to afford to build the Empire to start with. The entire operation pretty much started as piracy, you know. Oh dear, this is a lot to take in. Do we at least get to keep America? And I was able to learn it all, and so much more besides, in just a few minutes' time. And you can too, my lad! Just visit the link in the description down below to start your 7-day free trial with Blinkist, and even get 25% off your premium membership. Again, I really have no idea what a link in the description... Are you even talking to me anymore? Thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring the... Right, sorry. Thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring today's video, and now, back to the topic at hand. Recruits are improper for the Grenadiers and Light Infantry. Those companies should always appear at exercise as complete as possible, and have such men only in them as are perfect masters of their business. The flank companies were the elites of their respective regiments, and so ideally they would be made up of veteran soldiers who were well practiced and experienced. Because they were inherently operating in a more independent fashion, a quick wit and adaptable spirit would be of immense benefit to a light infantryman, and as you would expect, you also want them to be among the most accurate shots in the regiment and to know how to handle their muskets well. After all, odds are they're going to be doing a lot more independent firing than your average soldier would be. But during the late 18th century, except for things like the manual exercise, which is being handed down by order of the king, there really wasn't an awful lot of centralized military regulations on things like how a regiment is supposed to be managed, at least not when compared to later time periods. Things like recruitment and training had regulations, yes, but a lot of the specifics were largely up to the commanding officers of individual regiments. Things like how to fill out the various companies and ranks of the regiment. For example, and unfortunately for the army, it wasn't unheard of for a colonel to simply fill out his grenadier company with the regiment's tallest men, rather than considering their merits to actually serve in an elite company. You know, a colonel might seek out a more martial appearance rather than an actual martial bearing, especially during peacetime, when it's more about looking good than, well, actually fighting. Now, there were all sorts of military guides and manuals being published during this time period on how a regiment ought to handle its interior management, like the one that I cited earlier by Bennett Cuthbertson. But the trouble is that these weren't being handed down by a government apparatus. Rather, these are books of recommendations and suggestions by Army officers, some of which have more experience than others, on how they personally felt things ought to be done. So while these books by men like Bennett Cuthbertson or Thomas Symes are incredibly useful in helping us to understand how the army of this time period is operating, they also cannot be taken as absolutes. Think of these as the ideal systems, which many in the army would often be striving to achieve, but which they often fell short of as well. With that being said, I'm now going to use a number of these texts to paint a picture of how a light infantryman would ideally be selected and drilled. Again, just remember, this isn't an absolute, this is a guideline, if you will. With all that said, the flank companies above the normal battalion companies needed to always be filled out from the best possible candidates in the regiment. If and when a light infantryman needed to be replaced, the captain of the light infantrymen would decide on a man from the battalion companies and submit a request to the regiment's commanding officer for a transfer. And if by some chance the commanding officer decides it's appropriate, the worst soldier currently serving in the lights might be traded to the battalion company in the new man's place. Basically, a trade might take place. And to make sure that no one company is continuously losing their best soldiers to the flank companies, a roster would be made up by which each company would furnish men to them in turns. But above all other considerations, it was vital that a raw recruit never be allowed to enter the light infantry. There's a great example of exactly this practice taking place in the 40th Regiment's orderly book dating to the 8th of June, 1777, where it reads, quote, "The commanding officers of companies are desired to turn out this evening at roll call 2 of the properest men they have of a 12 months standing as soldiers in the regiment for the light infantry, that Captain Wolfe may choose out the number he wants to complete his company to 50 rank and file." One of the most particularly desired traits for a potential recruit to the light infantry was their speed and stamina. They ought to be able to move at 4 miles an hour under a full load without being the least fatigued, and be capable of marching up to 24 miles a day. At 4 miles an hour average, that's a 6-hour day of marching. Alongside their regular practice at more traditional marching and other maneuvers, as well as regular firing both of blanks and live rounds at targets whenever possible, the light infantry in particular also had to be well accustomed to, quote, "leaping, running, climbing precipices, swimming, skirmishing through woods, loading and firing in different attitudes," which is to say standing, kneeling, laying down in different difficult terrains, and marching with remarkable rapidity. Thomas Symes also wrote about the importance of swimming for the lights in case they ever came across a river without a bridge. And not only were they meant to march and traverse such difficult terrain, but far from the popular conception of the British standing in these strict and unyielding linear formations, the light infantrymen were meant to fight in these conditions as well, by, quote, "taking advantage of large stones, broken enclosures, old houses, or any strong feature which presents itself upon the face of a country." And when making use of that cover, they specifically took steps to ensure that they were keeping a good spacing, not bunching up or running in crowds all to the same position. They were trained to communicate and work together to achieve that sort of thing. On occasion, the lights could even be trained in how to use entrenching tools, as well as how to construct gabions and fascines, so if the need ever arose, they could fortify themselves. And alongside the necessity of their regular marksman practice, they would ideally be firing live rounds at targets pretty regularly. Again, the entire army really is, but the lights in particular. It would also be valuable for them to have an awareness of how much powder was in each of their cartridges, so that if the necessity ever arose, they could either load from a powder horn or even make up their own cartridges. Basically, they're being trained to have a more intimate awareness of their firearms and exactly how they're working. The ideal light infantryman was a quick-witted man of resilience, a veteran soldier who was expert in the manual exercise and the fatigues of a soldier. He could march at great lengths and overcome any obstacle before rushing at speed into battle, using the terrain to his advantage as he took carefully aimed shots. He was part of an elite, resilient, and adaptable force that could be deployed in a wide variety of circumstances, be that a traditional European battlefield or the oftentimes more nuanced environments of North American conflict. But even with these myriad advantages, the light infantry only represented a small portion of their respective regiments, never more than a handful of soldiers out of every few hundred, or around 10% of them altogether. Were these elite soldiers at the top of their field forever condemned to sit around as skirmishers and screening forces for the larger army? How could they ever be used to their full advantage, being so thinly spread among all the different regiments and collected in such small numbers? Well, the answer lies in the fluidity, the flexibility of the British Army's regimental system. Because while yes, on paper the light infantry were just individual companies attached to larger regiments, in practice that doesn't mean that the light infantry company actually has to be stationed with the rest of the regiment. You see, in contrast with other systems, within the British Army, the regiment wasn't really a combat organization so much as it was an administrative organization. Now, the system of regimental organization on the whole is a complicated enough topic for its own video, which I plan on making in the near future, but for our purposes today, think of it like this. The regiment is made up of a number of different companies, but those companies can more or less act independently of each other when the need arises. The majority of a regiment, yes, is generally going to be stationed in a central location, but individual companies would regularly be split off from that main force to go about some business or other. And sometimes that could be something pretty simple and routine, recruiting duty back home, building a fort, something like that. But other times, for more complicated procedures, like say going out on a battle, these companies might be combined with other companies, both from their own regiment and others, to march out as one larger combined unit. And that's exactly what would be done with the light infantry. Rather than having them all thinly spread out, shackled to their regiments as these indivisible large block formations, the British would regularly be taking their light infantry companies from multiple different regiments and combining them all together to act as their own independent and much larger light infantry units. You don't have to look any further than the first battle of the war to see this principle in action. For the expedition to Concord, the British Army put together a column consisting of grenadiers and light infantrymen from 10 different regiments plus the Royal Marines. Well, they weren't called Royal Marines until 1802, but that's another topic. His Majesty's Marines. It definitely wasn't 10 full regiments sent out to Concord. It was a selection of men, of individual companies from each regiment, all put under a singular command. Those different companies would have all had different color facings on their coats. They'd be wearing different buttons and lacing, and they'd look a little bit different. But for the purposes of the mission, they were all a part of the same unit. Battles like Brandywine or Germantown are other great examples of this principle, where we see individual light infantry battalions as part of wider brigades and armies. In the former example, each of the 2 light infantry battalions were actually larger on their own than full-strength regiments of the time, all of those men being light infantry. It was exactly this flexibility, this adaptability, in case you haven't heard that word enough so far, of the Army's organization that allowed the British to utilize their light infantry companies to their full potential. Not so much as light companies, although that definitely still happened as well, but as much larger light battalions and the like. Larger formations that are operating independently and at strength on the battlefield. Now that we know how they were equipped and trained and organized, how did the light infantry, whether fighting as an individual company or as a massive light infantry battalion, put all of this into practice? How did they fight? Well, first let's discuss what is meant by their actual name, light infantry. Now, obviously, in more classical time periods, the designations of light and heavy infantrymen would directly correlate with how those soldiers were outfitted. Heavy infantry would wear thicker armor, they're using heavier weapons, whereas light infantry are literally going to be lighter. But as we've already covered, the British light infantry of this time period were armed in more or less the same way as the rest of the infantry, and while their uniforms did differ, those differences weren't really strong enough to justify a whole new classification. Instead, for 18th century infantry, designations of light and heavy were determined by the role those soldiers played on the battlefield. Heavy infantry are the hard hitters. They're marching in those big blocks, they're firing in volleys, and they're forcibly pushing back enemy formations at the ends of their bayonets. You might think of it as using the weight of the formation rather than the individual soldiers, combined with fierce discipline to win the day. So what do the light infantry do? Well, exactly what you'd expect. They're operating in looser formations. They're running around on the battlefield. They're darting into combat, laying down deliberate, well-aimed individual fire before darting back out again when the situation gets rough. We already know that the British light infantry were proficient in their use of cover on the battlefield, but don't let that steer you wrong. They were still fighting in linear formations. It's just that rather than being shoulder to shoulder, they would keep open intervals of either 2 feet, 4 feet, even up to 10 feet between each file. They would keep their files to 2 men each, meaning that they're fighting in 2 ranks, although, to be fair, the entire British Army was for, honestly, most of their history. And rather than marching steadily into their various formations, the lights would actually run quickly from one position to another, dashing from line into column and back again at signals provided not by a cumbersome drum, but by a whistle. And while, yes, the entire army is adopting light infantry styles during this war in particular, and they are operating at open orders, they're only ever going to be at most probably 1 or 2 arms lengths away from each other. And that, as it is already going to be a lot more difficult than fighting shoulder to shoulder. For the light infantry, being able to do all of these things up to 10 feet apart from each other, that is an extraordinary feat for these men. In his book Noble Volunteers, Don Haggis describes this practice pretty well. They learned to collapse their lines into a column 2 men wide by having the men at the center of the line move forward while those at the left and right fell in behind them. They practiced forming on the left or on the right rather than on the center. Using similar techniques, the line could be reformed facing to the left or the right of its current direction. All of these maneuvers were practiced at a marching pace, at a quick pace, and at a run. The result was fluid, fast movement that could be accomplished over uneven or obstructed ground while maintaining the linear or columnar integrity of each company and of larger formations. And when the time came for those fast-moving formations to commence firing, that firing wouldn't be done by volleys with the entire formation expending their shots at the same time, but the order would come for the formation to commence an irregular fire, at which point each individual file is going to be shooting in their own time, loading and firing as quickly as they could while still taking carefully aimed shots. The most important thing during all of this would be to ensure that those file partners are communicating with each other and that at no time are both of them unloaded. Instead, as the first man fires his musket, he immediately steps behind his file partner and begins to reload. During that reloading process, the second man is going to be at full cock, ready to shoot, but he will not do so until the first man is done reloading. This is called firing by files, and it ensures 2 absolutely vital things for any light infantry formation. One is that you're able to keep up a steady and continuous fire as every individual file is acting independently and firing in their own time. That's an advantage that it would have over something like firing by ranks, which is dramatically overrated. And 2 is that at any given time, at least half of your formation will be loaded and ready to fire if you need to loose a full volley. Say, for example, the enemy leaves their cover and charges you, or a troop of cavalry comes into play. You want to make sure that you are not faced with a situation where some of your files are entirely unloaded and easy prey. Always have a round ready to go. It is to be particularly observed that each file has an entire dependence upon itself, and that the firelocks of the front and rear men are never to be unloaded at the same time. When the front rank man fires, the rear rank man is to make ready and step up briskly before his comrade, but is by no means to discharge his firelock until the other has loaded. This mutual defense and confidence is one of the most essential principles of light infantry. And of course, this isn't the only way the light infantrymen would ever fight either. If the situation ever demanded it, they could be doing things like firing by platoons, or street firing, that's a very common one, or even in traditional volleys, just like any other infantry formation. But if we'd like, I can talk about all of that as well in a future video, the different kinds of firings and whatnot. But the point is, they can do anything that a regular soldier can do, a battalion man can do, because that's where they're starting. They have probably a year of experience doing all of that. They are masters of their regular soldier's art, and then all of this additional training is being put on top of it. Again, these are elite units. And when the light infantry are fighting in tandem with other units, they would often be specifically employed as screening forces, as skirmishers, and flankers. As a screening force, say if an army is marching along a road, the light infantrymen would get the tougher job of marching through the countryside or the woods or whatever on either side of that road to act as the first line of defense against any possible ambushes and the like. As a skirmishing force, they could also be positioned at the very front of an army as its vanguard, or at the very rear of the army as its rear guard, ensuring that whatever foe may come to range in their sights, they will be the first to meet them in battle and either hold them back long enough for the main formations to escape, or hold them in place long enough to let the rest of the army come up for the general engagement. And as flanking forces, during battle, while an enemy is tied down by the regular infantry, the lights could be sent on these wide flanking maneuvers to get around the side of the enemy and attack them from the rear, or to gain access to some otherwise difficult access point of advantage. The Battle of Long Island is a spectacular example of this, where the British troops marched overnight around the rebel army, only to come up at them from both sides the next day. Whether a minor skirmish or a general action, the British light infantrymen were renowned on the battlefield for their speed and their precision. They used specially adapted formations to rapidly traverse difficult terrain and fought from positions of strength with accurate and rapid, independent fire. They used that independent spirit alongside good coordination and communication to ensure that they were ready for any surprise that the rebels might have thrown their way. Like the song says, they were as fierce as a tiger and as swift as the roe. And that, my dear viewer, is who the British light infantry of the American War of Independence were. Specially trained veteran soldiers who were well equipped with efficiency at their core. A far cry from the unyielding robots of so much popular history, these bloodhounds, as some came to be known, were independently minded and highly adaptable both on and off the battlefield. By the end of the war, the British Army had some of the best light infantrymen in the entire world, and they were remarkably skilled at the more irregular styles of North American warfare. So much so, in fact, that honestly a lot of what we discussed in this video, especially things like fighting in open order and running on the battlefield, could actually be applied to more or less the entire British Army during this war, because the rest of the army is being trained in light infantry combat, because it's being seen to be so efficient. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I'd recommend two extraordinary books. Noble Volunteers by Don Hagest and With Zeal and with Bayonets Only by Matthew Spring. Those works really are the quintessential scholarly pieces when it comes to understanding how the British Army was operating in North America at this time. And if you'd like to see all of the primary sources which I've cited in this video for yourself, well, you can find all of those provided free of charge as PDF downloads at my website, nativeoak.org.
Thank you all for watching, and to Niels from the 40th Foot for giving me some pointers on this topic. If you'd like to see an amazing Rev War unit that portrays light infantry very well, I'll include a link to their Facebook page in the description below. This video has been published in support of the Native Oak and was made possible by the generosity of our membership on patreon.com, as well as by today's sponsor, Blinkist. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.